defended himself. We looked at that in verses 3 through 7 in that defense, and how walking in the flesh, and it was be too severe with them, and so on and so forth. So we're going to pick up right there in verse number 6 of Paul's defense. And the first portion of his defense was that he did not walk after the flesh. Now, the second portion of his defense, and it's a threefold defense here, we find in verse number 6 is that he did not want to be too severe. So go ahead there, Chad, and pull up number 2. I think it should. Yeah, click through all that. All right, second reason here, Paul was meek and mild, right? We mentioned this a little bit last week. I kind of want to go back over it again. Is that the Corinthians here, he did not want to be, too tough or severe with the Corinthians. And if you look at verse 6 specifically, Paul was intending... let's read verse 6 first. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6. And having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Okay? Now, in the context of these 8 verses here, in the first, or 7 verses here in the first part of chapter 10, how Paul was mentioning and talking about his defenses here. This verse 6 kind of seems a bit maybe hard to understand. But Paul, in verse 6, was intending or getting this point across, that he essentially is ready to rebuke or punish or speak out against anybody else that was remaining, that was insubordinate to Paul once the submission of these people was complete, right? So we got to think about the Corinthians here, and that they were accusing Paul of these variety of things because he essentially was telling them some stuff that they didn't really want to hear, right? He was calling them out on some of the errors that they had in their living, in their worship, in their service. And he's gone through the first portions here of chapter 10 and had to defend against these critics. And he's trying to tell the Christians here at Corinth that if he wanted to be stern, right? If he wanted to really rebuke them, he could. And that he essentially kind of had a right to. But he did not want to be severe with all of them. And he wanted to give the Corinthians the opportunity here to kind of voluntarily accept the fact that he was or had apostolic authority in the teaching of them. Okay? He was ready to punish anybody who was remaining insubordinate, right? But he wanted them to have the opportunity to voluntarily kind of submit to his teachings. And during his visit in Corinth, he would deal sternly with anybody who was left over who had not accepted the fact that God had kind of given him this apostolic authority. So he didn't want to be severe with them, right? That's what he's saying in verse 6. And having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience. Like, I'm ready to do it when your obedience is fulfilled. He didn't want to have to do that, right? So that was another reason why, as he's answering here in his defense, he just didn't want to kind of be too tough on him, all right? Third part of this, kind of verse 7, his third part is defense of himself here, is that he cites here his critics' bias. Okay, and they have some bias here. Verse 7, do ye look on things after the outward appearance, and if any man trust to himself that he is Christ, let him of himself think this again, that as he is Christ, even so we are Christ. Right? So Paul's third answer to the charge of cowardliness was that his critics were judging him or critiquing him from a very biased perspective. very, very biased perspective. The first sentence here of verse 7 could be a question, it could be a command, or it can simply just be a statement. And it seems the best here to kind of take the first sentence of chapter or verse number 7, take it as a statement of fact. That seems to be the best way to kind of look at this. Paul's critics judge matters solely based on their outward appearance, right? Do ye look on things after the outward appearance? Superficial view of Paul's apostleship, right? That's what he's saying here. They had a very superficial view of his apostleship, and he wanted to point out that if they would take the time to look more deeply, right, into the matter, spend more time, not just from a surface level, but really more deeply at the matter of what it was going on, of Paul's teachings in his service, they would then realize the genuine nature of his apostleship. But they just wanted to look at it at face value, surface level, and they were critiquing him because of that. Paul's opponents, right, his critics here, they claim to belong to Christ. But Paul told the Corinthians to reassure themselves that he too belonged to Christ, right? It wasn't just them. Paul also in his service belonged to Christ as well. Is it a sin, or why is it a sin for a person to think that his or her special relationship with Christ, right? Is it a sin, or why is it a sin for a person to think that their relationship with Christ makes them better than other people? Is that a sin, or why is it a sin? Yes, it is a sin. Why is it a sin? To think that your Christian relationship with Christ makes you better than people. What is that belief or idea rooted in? Self-righteousness or pride, right? Self-righteousness or pride, exactly. Why is it then, follow up, why is it a sin for a person to think that he or she is deficient as a Christian and can't measure up to everybody else? Why is that a sin?
It's the same thing.
It's
the negative side.
It's self-pity, right? Okay. It's just the opposite end of the coin. Self-righteousness, thinking you're too good. Self-pity, thinking I'm just never going to be good enough, right? It's exactly the same thing. Good. Perfect. All right. Second charge here, verses 8 through 18. Paul answers the second thing that they were being critical of, and let's read verses 8, 9, and 10 to get into this. Now, this is cowardliness was the first charge. The second charge here is weakness. Okay, as you can see up there, the charge of weakness, verses 8, 9, and 10. For though I should boast, bookmark out of the way, somewhat more of authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification, not for your destruction. Excuse me. I should not be ashamed, that I may not seem as if I would terrify you by letters. For his letters say they are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible. Okay? Paul wrote here, verse number 8, that even he maybe boasted a little too much in his authority. Right? And if he boasted a little too much of his authority, he's not going to be ashamed of that. Verse 8, for though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification. Right? So apparently his opponents were accusing him of boasting. Right? But Paul here, he was not ashamed to speak about the authority that God had given him, right? Because God had given it to him. So they thought he was boasting, and Paul says that maybe I am, right? But God's given me this authority. And because God had given it to him, right, it was not something he had taken on himself. He had not, tried to. He's not boasting in himself in any way, right? But he, was, even if he had boasted, he's not going to be ashamed of it. Now, Now, he hadn't, but if he had, Paul said, I wouldn't be ashamed of it because God has given me the authority, right? God has blessed me with this. God has given me this. He's charged me with this. So he would not be, it wouldn't be a self-boasting by no means, right? It would be an edification of God. And that's what Paul is trying to defend here, or what he's telling to these Christians. So what happens here to a church whose pastors, what happens to a church whose pastor uses his authority to edify the believers? What happens in a church, or to a church, if the pastor uses his authority to edify believers? Does the pastor have the authority to edify believers, first of all? Yes. Okay, absolutely. What happens in a church when the pastor uses that? Growth. Exactly, right? Spiritual growth takes place. Exactly right. The edification of one another. And ultimately, who gets glorified? God does. Okay, ultimately God gets glorified. So what was not a reason for God's giving authority to Paul? What was not a reason that Paul gave, or God gave Paul the authority? Verse 7 tells us here, or 8, excuse me, not for destruction, right? Paul's not here to destroy and tear these people down. Could have Paul have done that? Yes. Right? Absolutely. But that was not what the God-giving authority to what Paul has done. But God gave him the authority to help edify, and help his sheep, people under him, people are reading this and that he's ministering to help them grow. That's exactly what Paul should have been doing, right? And he even goes on to say that even if he had boasted, he hadn't, but even if he had, it really wouldn't be ashamed of it, because God gave authority to Paul to build up churches. Right? That's what Paul was doing. So he was the missionary. He was getting these churches going and helping them grow and teaching them the ways in which how they should conduct themselves within their worship and service of God. It was not to come in and tear it down. That's not what Paul was trying to do. Now, in order for the Corinthian church specifically here to grow, Paul had to address some of the problems that needed to be torn down, right? But he wasn't tearing down their character. He was essentially telling them the things that needed to be fixed or altered so that they could edify, right? Edification is not always just constant praise, you're doing so great. That's part of it, yes, absolutely. That encourages us. But there's also growth comes from the pruning of other stuff, right? Talked about that before. You get rid of some of them, sucker of the old tomato plants, you get rid of some of those leaves and branches that are leaching the life, that aren't doing anything, and as soon as you prune those bad boys, you see the top of that tomato plant really start to grow. So edification involves sometimes being critiqued by the person who is helping you to grow so that you can see that I got to get rid of some of this trash out of my life, right? That's what Paul here is doing. Now, not for the destruction, which is what the Corinthians are accusing him of, because they don't like some of the stuff Paul's saying, because he's calling them out on their errors. But God has given him that authority. In our churches today, our pastors and other believers have authority over us. Godly pastors use this authority to edify the members of the church, just like Paul did. Right? Verse 9 here, in 10, you find the heart of the accusation. That I may not seem as if I would terrify you by letters, but for his letters say they are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. Okay? His opponents here claim that his letters were meant to scare or terrify the church, and were weighty and powerful and had all this language in them. But Paul, when he showed up, his bodily presence was weak and his speech was contemptible, right? And they charged, as mentioned in verse number 1, that Paul could be as strong as a lion when absent and writing these letters, but when he showed up, he was weak and cowardly when his presence was there. And because of that, they said that his words were not worth listening to. How would you feel if your opponents, like Paul, attacked you? Right? So that's the accusation here. So Paul has to defend, right? Verses 11, 12, or 11 down to verse 18. We have now a fourfold defense against the charge of weakness. They kind of claimed that Paul was able to say all these important, powerful things, but when he showed up, he was just a weak little man, and that was the problem. Now, he didn't like that. So the rest of this chapter here, all the way down to verse 18, Paul defends himself against this charge. Fourfold answer in the first portion of this, as you can see, is that his critics would soon see his strengths. First thing he says here in these verses, starting in verse number 11. Let such a one think this, that such as we are in word by letters when we are absent, such will be also in deed when we are present. If his, Paul says this, no, I'm going to put this in maybe some Lance terms here. But he says this, and Paul said, if you think my writings are terrifying, wait till I show up. Wait till I show up in there. You're going to find me terrifying in person as well. If you thought that my writings were firm and powerful, right? Wait till I get there. Paul's intending, right? He's intending to use the apostolic authority that God has granted them when he shows up in Corinth. And he was going to be stern in defense of the gospel because he, quite frankly, was probably fed up with these idiots not listening, right? In a roundabout way. I think that Paul doesn't have that same type of mentality, right? But he understands that this path for these Christians, and them not wanting and listening to him, is going to just the beginning of a very quick slide away from the service of God. And it's going to eventually, if they stay on this path, render them very much ineffective in serving God in that city there in Corinth. Okay, so Paul didn't want to be too severe, right, against the first charge, but as they kind of accused him of kind of being boisterous and being able to write a bunch of good stuff, but showing up and not being very strong, like he's realizing now that they're not just attacking Paul, right? That's not what they're attacking. Paul takes this as an attack against who? God himself, right? Because God has granted him this authority anyways. So Paul says, listen, boys, you thought it was tough in what I wrote down. Wait till I show up. Because he's going to be stern for the gospel. When have you found it necessary, this is a rhetorical question, to be stern for the sake of the gospel? Second thing here, his critics have unwisely conducted themselves. Okay, verse 12, for we dare not make ourselves of number or compare ourselves with some of them that commend themselves, but they measuring themselves by themselves, in comparing themselves among themselves are not wise. They have unwisely commended themselves, right? Unwisely commended themselves. He defended his boldness in speech, but showed that he was not as bold as his opponents had been. His critics were being so bold, in fact, that they rested their authority to be able to rebuke God's apostle on their own self-recommendation, right? They thought that they were so holy and that they were living so correctly and so righteously that they had the authority to look at God's man and say, you are not doing what God called you to do. That's where they were at, right? They thought themselves that they were able to, be like me, looking at Pastor Rob and saying, I ain't got to listen to you. You don't know what you're talking about. Right? That's essentially what they were doing. Pastor Rob gets up to preach this morning and he didn't leave. They ain't listening to that mess today. He don't know what he's talking about no more than he does. That's what this was. That would be preposterous, right? You can kind of giggle, but that would be crazy for me to do that. But that's exactly what was taking place. So Paul here, right, is telling them, you have unwisely recommended yourself in the correct display of righteous living, and then you have taken God's authority that he has given me directly, and now you're arguing with it and trying to counter it and saying that your ways are better and I have no idea what I'm talking about. So you can kind of see why Paul said, listen, boys, you think I'm bad now? Wait till I show up. You can see why he wants to defend God in this way. That kind of reckless boldness, that it's reckless, right? That was totally foreign to Paul. Paul couldn't really even comprehend that. It was such a foreign concept to him. And that's why he calls it downright foolish and unwise. What's the harm in using each other as a spiritual measuring stick? What harm is it in using other Christians as a spiritual measuring stick?
Wrong standard brings the wrong result.
Yes, exactly right. Who is this measuring stick for us? Christ, right? That should always be the case, right? We shouldn't look at other Christians and think, you know what, I'm not, like, living maybe as good as they are, or I'm living a little better than they are. Like, that shouldn't be what the standard is, right? The standard is Christ. Right. And that's what we compare ourselves to, right? And we're always going to fall short of that standard. But I look at somebody who I know is saved who ain't living real good, and we know stuff's going bad, and I can compare myself to them, and I can say, I ain't living as bad as they're living. And then we can kind of start to feel pretty good about ourselves, and then we get our own self-righteousness, right? And we then use our own self-recommendation against others. This is exactly what the Corinthian Christians were doing. The standard is always Jesus Christ. We have a saying in our household. Stole it, but we have a saying. The standard is the standard, right? Pippa came home with some good grades, and she, of course, wanted to bring in and show them to us, and I told her that I expect you to miss no questions. That's the standard, right? The standard is the standard. And she kind of looked at me, and that's something that I say a lot. I say it to my kids in my class. And some of it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? Is Pippa always going to come home with 100 on her? I hope so, but I get it, right? I understand that. But if the thought process is excellence only, everything else is a failure if it's not excellence, that's the standard for Christian living as well. Because we compare ourselves to Christ. That's the standard. And I try to make sure everything I do in my life as a Christian meets that standard. I'm going to fail. Absolutely. But I can see the areas that I need to improve on, and I can become more and more successful and effective in being a witness for Jesus Christ if I'm constantly comparing my life to the way that He lived His life, because He is the standard. And righteous living is the standard. And the standard is the standard. So that's what Paul's telling them here, right? That's exactly what he's saying here. The self-recommendation is totally and entirely foolish. Third thing, the Corinthians' faith commended Paul. It's his third critique or answer to this charge. His opponents had wrongly invaded a church. Okay, that's what happened here. But by God's grace, Paul had founded the church in Corinth, and he had won the Corinthians over to the Lord. And God had led him to Corinth, and Paul had started the church in their city. He did not need to commend himself as his attackers commended themselves. The Corinthians' faith itself, the fact that they were there in the church, right, and listening to Paul, their faith was what was commending him, because they were evidence of what he had done. A lot of craziness going on in Corinth. You had the Gnostics, right? You had the Gnostics and their self-living gospel that they were doing. They were writing these gospels down. They were trying to infiltrate the church, to say that things like Christ wasn't who He said He was. He was able to attain His Christ likeness by doing these certain things and living these certain ways, right? That had infiltrated the church there in the early church, and it was a direct counter to what Paul was teaching. And because of that, out of that came the Corinthian church that God allowed Paul to start, and these Christians that were there, and they were the living evidence of his authority that God had given him. Paul's critics here had moved in on Paul's work and took over, and they had very little interest in starting anything new. They wanted to boast in what somebody else had accomplished. Go down to verse 16 right there of chapter 10. To preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line of things made ready to our hand. They wanted to be in charge of something big and something noteworthy, and they are trying to take over what Paul had done. But the fact that they even wanted to do that, right, and that work was there, was a commendation of Paul and his authority that God had, in fact, given him. Here's your question. I don't really particularly like the way this is worded, but I'm going to read to you. Why might it be wrong for believers to abandon or ignore a church? Let me start again. Why might it be wrong for believers to abandon or ignore a church plant to join a large church that has more to offer? Why is it wrong for believers to abandon or ignore a church plant to join a large church that has more to offer? Shows selfishness, right, in the motives. That's probably a little more. Let's move on. Last thing here is the Lord commending him. Okay. Ultimate proof here. Paul saves essentially the best for last. The final ultimate proof of Paul's apostolic authority came from, of course, God himself. Okay. Verse number 18. Let's read 17 and 18. But he that glorieth, let him glory in God. Verse 18. But for not he that commendeth himself is approved. So the people who commend themselves are not approved. That's what the Corinthians were doing. But whom the Lord commendeth. The person that God put in charge, which is Paul, right? That's the ultimate evidence of this, right? So that was all the approval that Paul needed. He really didn't care if the Corinthians commended him or recommended him or not. He wanted them to, because he didn't want them to fall down the slippery slope of staying away from God. But essentially, he cared for them, right, and cared for their spiritual well-being, but he did not care if they were self-recommending because they didn't like what he had to say. Because God had told Paul and given him that apostolic authority, and that's really all that mattered to Paul. That's all he cared about. God had approved him. Got three scenarios here we're going to finish up with. And in these three scenarios, we are going to come up with, or maybe discuss, the ways in which a person should respond to the criticism that they're receiving. Okay? So that's what there's three of them here. A pastor here devotes more than 60 hours per week to the work of the ministry. Okay, he doesn't neglect any area of pastoral ministry, but a few malcontents in the congregation are severely criticizing him because, this is the reason for his criticism, the church attendance isn't increasing as much as they think it should. They are spreading their opinion that the pastor is lazy. How should the pastor handle the criticism? So again, I'll read it to you again. pastor here devotes more than 60 hours per week to the work of the ministry, doesn't neglect any of his pastoral ministries, but a few of the people in the congregation are criticizing him because the church isn't growing in attendance like they think that it should. Okay, and they're spreading they are spreading the opinion that the pastor is lazy because the attendance isn't going up. How should the pastor handle this criticism? I don't have any answers for these, or we're going to come up with these. How should a pastor handle this criticism? Anybody have an answer?
See, then neither he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase.
Okay, that's a good one. Sure, that's a very pastor answer. Day out answer it. Whose job is it to invite people to church?
Everyone.
That was my first thought. It's not Pastor Rob's job. I'm going to use him in this example. No, it isn't mine. It's not Pastor Rob's job solely to get people to attend this church. Right? It's not. It's our job as a body of believers to help increase here at church, right? And there's not anything we can do about it anyways, right? We're not going to be the one that gives the increase. As Pastor Rob said, we've actually a couple weeks ago mentioned that, right? But it is our job to do what with those seeds. We got to plant them, right? It is our job to plant them. It is not our job to water them and make sure they have the sunlight and all this, but it is our job to do that, right? So, no, he is not in turn being lazy. It's the people that are complaining about him being lazy, not putting themselves out there to go and invite more people to church, because that's the job. That's the responsibility. That's the requirements. There's the first one, okay? Candace's mother, second scenario, Candace's mother wants her to excel in everything, from music to math and from cooking to grooming. Consequently, Candace's mother pushes her too hard and never allows her for any just harmless teenage fun. Other parents have cautioned Candace's mother about pushing her daughter to exasperation and perhaps a nervous breakdown. Even Candace has asked her mother to stop being a smother and just be a mother. How should Candace's mother handle the criticism? Anybody have an answer? How should Candace's mother handle the criticism?
If lots of people are saying it, she probably ought to consider if there's any truth there at all and pray about her role as mother and then do what she thinks is best.
Okay. Like that answer. Would everybody agree? Collectively agree? Sure. I think that's true, right? And I think we all can easily fall into the trap of wanting to make sure our kids are doing and being the very best, right? And all these different things. And there's a line there that is important that we don't make your kids resentful because you've pushed too much, but they also need to be pushed some, right? I mean, we know that and experience that, or am experiencing that, right? So it's an important thing, but being prayerful and making sure that things are done correctly. And not pushing, and here's a big thing in our day and age, especially now, is like making sure that the extracurriculars don't involve time taking away from church, right? The extracurriculars can't become more important than church, right? Church should be the thing that is the relationship with God most important, and then if you have time for extracurriculars after that, that's okay. That's a good thing. And that's, I think it's, especially now, all the travel stuff going on, all the things that are happening, it's very important that we don't see it happen a lot. Last one, real quick. A married couple, Joel and Tavia, are actively involved in the leadership of their church. They serve on several committees, provide special music for the Sunday service, teach Sunday school, entertain church groups in their home. Unfortunately, a few church members accept positions of responsibility when they are... Unfortunately, few church members actually accept positions of responsibility when they're available. But a number of the church members are criticizing Joel and Tavia's service involvement, and they are accusing Joel and Tavia of running the church. How should Joel and Tavia handle the criticism? So they're the ones doing a lot of the serving. Nobody else kind of steps up and does anything, but the people who aren't doing anything are criticizing them for what they're doing. How should they handle that criticism?
Become involved. If you don't like how things are run, become involved.
Right, so how should Joel and Tavia handle it? By telling them that?
Yeah.
Yes? Oh, so absolutely.
Is God laying something on your heart? Because I feel like I'm doing an awful lot, and there's other people that could step up and do something.
That's a much nicer way to say what I would have said. Right? I mean, exactly. Hey, buddy, you don't like it? Do it yourself. Right? That's the response, right? This is what I feel like I should be doing. This is what I feel like God wants me to do this. If you don't like it, then hey, go find you do something. And then maybe God is calling you, giving you a push to do something, right? That's the response, right? So maybe that's obviously a much nicer way that should be handled. This is the way, but I think that's the way that they should be in handling that criticism. As long as Joel and Tavia are serving so much and serving that way because they feel God wants them to, not because they want to be kind of in charge of stuff, right? And I think here the way that this reads, that they feel like they should be doing this, and this is what God has blessed them and encouraged them to do this with, that's what they're doing. So that should be the way, I agree, the way that should be handled as well. You know, maybe this is what I feel like I should be doing. Maybe God is pushing you to do something as well, serve by all means. We'd love some help, right? That's maybe a good way to kind of look at that, okay? What should proper response be the next time you're criticized? What should proper response be the next time you're criticized about something? Humility, yes, right? It's always good to speak less and listen more, even if down in here, like stuff's bubbling and you want to kind of fire back, right? It's better to nod and smile, right, and say okay or appreciate it, and that's a good way to handle things, right? You know, there's times where I've been criticized and am criticized, and I have learned, right, that somebody has a suggestion, right, or some criticism about what I'm doing, what I should be doing. A response that I found that works good for me is saying, you know what, that's a pretty good idea. Let me think about that. And then that usually kind of diffuses the situation, and those people are most of the time kind of come, well, at least maybe consider it and go on. And then do I think about that criticism again? No, sometimes I don't. I just let it go, kind of, and that's not always a good way to handle it. But in the moment, and kind of say, you know what? That's let me think about that. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. That's something I haven't considered, right? And then kind of go from there. But the humility, right, and just having kind of an understanding, that we don't know a lot of times what that person is dealing with either, right? We don't know what kind of day they've had. We don't know what kind of week they've had. We don't know maybe the home situation they're coming out. We just don't know, right? So lashing out, firing back criticisms, not always the best way. Humility, humbleness. Sometimes we got to just turn the other cheek, right? Like Christ said, and take the criticism criticism as it comes and kind of move on. And sometimes that criticism is constructive, and we need to hear it because we haven't been living the way that we should, or there is a better way to do things, right? The case may be. So go ahead, you bring up the last thing. So to finish up your lesson number 11, we see that handle criticism in a God-honoring way, right? Having that humility, listening, and taking the time to listen to it, even if we don't agree with it or like it, that's still handling criticism in a God-honoring way, and that's the best way to do it. Next week, we jump into lesson 12, and it looks more at our personal testimony. Okay, Paul goes into some more defense here. He shows his life essentially as a defense. He has a case here against the Judaizers, that the false prophets, and he has a case against them. And then Paul gives his testimony as an apostle as well. So that's what we'll get into next week, and then probably that'll take probably 2 weeks. And then, so I would say by the 1st of October, if not the second Sunday, we'll be starting our study in the book of Joshua. And that's where we're going to be going next. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this lesson, for Paul's examples and explanations on how to handle people who are critiquing and criticizing some of the things that we're doing, Lord. How you would want us to handle those things as well. I pray we take these lessons to heart. We understand the way in which you want us to righteously deal with each of these situations, Lord. And we remember that when those times come around, so we can be good witness and testimony for your prayer for Pastor Rob as he comes here the next hour as well. Keep us attentive to the word you have for us through him. I pray. Amen.